3 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Sarah stood in the community center of Meadowbrook Heights, looking out at a room full of neighbors she had never expected to call friends. The monthly HOA meeting had been transformed from a small gathering of board members into a packed community forum where residents actually had a voice in their neighborhood's future. Maya, now 6 months old, sat contentedly in her stroller, occasionally making happy sounds that drew smiles from the people around her. Sarah still marveled at how much their lives had changed since that morning when she had simply wanted to water her flowers in peace. The national attention following the viral video had brought scrutiny that the old HOA leadership could not withstand. After Robert Chen resigned in disgrace and 2 other board members followed him out the door, a complete investigation of the association's practices revealed years of discriminatory enforcement and financial mismanagement. Sarah had been reluctant to get involved in the political side of the neighborhood's transformation, but her neighbors had convinced her that her voice was needed. She now served as the chair of a new community relations committee that had been created to ensure fair treatment for all residents. The changes went far beyond just replacing a few board members. The entire enforcement system had been overhauled with new policies that required documentation, multiple warnings, and appeals processes for all violations. Most importantly, all enforcement actions now had to be applied consistently across the community, with no exceptions based on how long someone had lived there or how well they were connected to the board. The discriminatory security contract had been terminated immediately after the incident. The new security company was required to use de-escalation training and could only respond to actual emergencies, not civil disputes over landscaping or mailbox decorations. Canine units were completely prohibited except in cases of genuine threats to public safety. Sarah smiled as she remembered the day she had finally been able to move her mother's garden gnome back to its place of honor by the mailbox. She had done it quietly without fanfare, but several neighbors had noticed and stopped by to admire the small figure and hear the story of why it meant so much to Sarah. The gnome now sat in the center of what had become known as Sarah's Memorial Garden, a beautiful display of flowers, herbs, and decorative stones that had grown far beyond her original modest planting. Neighbors had contributed plants, stepping stones, and even a small bench where people could sit and enjoy the peaceful space. But the most meaningful change for Sarah was the sense of community that had developed in Meadowbrook Heights. The confrontation had forced people to examine their own behavior and consider whether they had been complicit in discrimination by staying silent. Many had decided they never wanted to feel that shame again. Mrs. Patterson had become one of Sarah's closest friends and a fierce advocate for transparency in all HOA decisions. The Martinez couple, David and Jennifer, had joined Sarah on the Community Relations Committee and helped create new resident orientation programs that welcomed newcomers instead of looking for reasons to cite them. Mr. Washington had been elected to serve another term on the board, and his experience and wisdom had been invaluable in creating the new policies. He often told Sarah that seeing her stand up to Robert Chen had inspired him to be more vocal about discrimination, instead of just trying to work quietly behind the scenes. The veteran support group that Sarah had started met twice a month in the community center. What had begun as an idea to help military families navigate civilian life had grown into a network of mutual support that included spouses, children, and community members who wanted to show appreciation for veterans' service. Max, the German shepherd who had been at the center of the confrontation, had become an unexpected part of Sarah's story. After the security company was terminated, Max's handler, Officer Martinez, had reached out to Sarah personally. He explained that he had left the security industry and was retraining Max for therapy work instead of aggressive enforcement. Martinez had asked Sarah if she would be willing to help with Max's transition. Given her expertise with working dogs, Sarah had agreed, and now Max visited the veteran support group regularly as a therapy animal. The transformation from attack dog to gentle companion had been remarkable, and Max seemed to remember Sarah as the person who had helped him find a better path. The legal resolution had taken several months to complete. Sarah had hired the lawyer who had reached out to her after seeing the viral video, and together they had built a strong case against both the security company and the HOA for discrimination, harassment, and endangerment. The security company had settled quickly, implementing new training protocols and agreeing to substantial financial compensation for Sarah and Maya. More importantly, they had agreed to revise their policies nationwide to prevent similar incidents in other communities. The HOA settlement had included not just financial compensation, but also binding agreements about fair enforcement, community oversight, and protections for residents who reported discrimination. Sarah had insisted that most of the settlement money be used to create programs that would benefit the entire community, including playground improvements, educational resources, and emergency assistance funds for residents facing financial hardship. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the change in Robert Chen himself. Sarah had learned through Mr. Washington that Chen's aggressive behavior had been driven partly by his own fears and insecurities about his place in the community. The public exposure of his discriminatory actions had forced him to confront his own prejudices. Chen had eventually approached Sarah through a mutual neighbor to request a private meeting. Sarah had been hesitant, but she had agreed to meet with him in the presence of Mr. Washington as a mediator. The conversation had been difficult and emotional, but Chen had offered a genuine apology and acknowledged the harm his actions had caused. He explained that he had felt threatened by changes in the neighborhood and had used his position on the board to try to control those changes. He admitted that his treatment of Sarah, the Martinez family, and other residents had been unfair and discriminatory. Most importantly, he asked what he could do to make amends. Sarah had been surprised by her own response. Instead of anger or demands for further punishment, she had felt compassion for a man who had let fear drive him to hurt other people. She had suggested that Chen volunteer with local organizations that work to build understanding between different communities. Chen had followed through on that suggestion, and Sarah had been amazed to learn that he now volunteered with a refugee resettlement program, helping new immigrants navigate American systems and find housing. The transformation was not complete. Chen still struggled with his own prejudices, but he was actively working to become a better person. As Sarah looked around the packed community meeting, she reflected on how much had changed in just 3 months. The neighborhood that had once felt hostile and unwelcoming had become a place where people looked out for each other and worked together to solve problems. Maya had started crawling the week before, and she was already exploring every corner of their small house with fearless curiosity. Sarah loved watching her daughter's confidence and wondered if, growing up in this transformed community, would give Maya the same sense of empowerment that Sarah had found through standing up for herself. The meeting was called to order, and Sarah listened as various committee reports were presented. The Architectural Review Committee reported on new streamlined processes for home modifications. The Safety Committee discussed the success of the new Community Watch program that relied on neighbors helping neighbors rather than aggressive security patrols. When it was time for the Community Relations Committee report, Sarah stood up and looked around the room at faces that had become familiar and friendly. She spoke about the progress they had made in creating fair enforcement policies and the ongoing work to ensure that all residents felt welcome and valued. But she also challenged the community to keep growing and improving. Change is not a one-time event, she said. It's an ongoing process that requires all of us to examine our own behavior and speak up when we see unfairness or discrimination. We can't go back to the way things were before, where some people had power and others had to accept whatever treatment they received. The applause that followed was warm and genuine. Sarah could see nods of agreement throughout the room, including from some residents who had initially been skeptical of the changes. After the meeting ended, Sarah walked home through the quiet streets of Meadowbrook Heights, pushing Maya's stroller and enjoying the peaceful evening air. The neighborhood looked the same as it had when she first moved there, with clean sidewalks and well-maintained houses. But everything else had changed. As she passed the memorial garden by her mailbox, Sarah stopped for a moment to adjust her mother's gnome, which had been slightly displaced by the sprinklers. The small figure looked happy in its original spot, surrounded by flowers and protected by a community that now understood its importance. Maya looked up at her mother from the stroller and smiled, reaching her small hands toward the... By 3 o'clock that same afternoon, Sarah's life had changed completely. She was sitting in her kitchen feeding Maya when her phone started, buzzing with notifications she had never expected to receive. Mrs. Patterson had posted the video of the morning's confrontation on her Facebook page, and within hours it had been shared hundreds of times. The video showed everything exactly as it had happened. Robert Chen making false accusations about Sarah's landscaping. The security officers treating her with suspicion and hostility, despite her polite cooperation. The moment when Officer Martinez released Max without warning, and most dramatically, Sarah's instant professional control of the attacking dog, followed by her calm explanation of her military background. Sarah watched the video on Mrs. Patterson's phone with a mixture of pride and worry. She was proud that people could see she had done nothing wrong and had protected her daughter with skill and courage. But she was also worried about what would happen next. Going viral on social media was not something she had planned or wanted. The first phone call came at 4:15. A reporter from the local television news station had seen the video and wanted to interview Sarah about her experience. Sarah politely declined, saying she needed time to process what had happened and make decisions about her next steps. But the calls kept coming. More reporters. A civil rights organization that specialized in homeowners association disputes, a veterans advocacy group that had seen her military background mentioned in the social media posts. Even a lawyer who offered to represent her if she decided to file a lawsuit against the security company. By evening, the story had been picked up by several major news websites. The headlines were dramatic and attention-grabbing. Veteran mom uses military training to stop police dog attack over garden. Dispute. HOA security releases attacked dog on woman holding baby. Former military dog handler saves herself. And infant from aggressive canine unit. Sarah realized that her quiet life in Meadowbrook Heights was over. At least temporarily. She was now the center of a national conversation about police overreach, HOA abuse, and the treatment of military veterans. It was overwhelming and frightening, but also strangely empowering. The response from her neighbors was immediate and positive. Throughout the afternoon and evening, people knocked on her door to check on her and Maya. They brought flowers, homemade food, and offers of help with anything she might need. Many apologized for not speaking up sooner about Robert Chen's harassment campaign. Mrs. Patterson told Sarah that she had lived in the neighborhood for 12 years and had never seen anyone treated the way Sarah had been treated. She said Robert Chen had always been difficult and controlling, but his behavior towards Sarah had been unusually hostile and persistent. Two other neighbors, a young couple named David and Jennifer Martinez, revealed that they had received similar harassment from Robert Chen when they first moved in 3 years earlier. They were Latino, and Robert had found multiple excuses to cite them for violations that other residents seemed exempt from. They had eventually given up fighting and just tried to stay out of his way. Sarah began to understand that what had happened to her was part of a larger pattern of discrimination and abuse within the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. Robert Chen and others had been using their positions to target residents they saw as outsiders or threats to their vision of the community. The most surprising visitor was an elderly African-American man named James Washington who lived 4 streets over. He had seen the video online and walked to Sarah's house to introduce himself and share his own experience. Mr. Washington had been one of the first Black families to move into Meadowbrook Heights 15 years earlier. He told Sarah that he and his wife had faced constant harassment and violation notices for their first 5 years in the neighborhood. Like Sarah, they had been cited for violations that seemed to be ignored when white residents committed the same infractions. "The difference between your situation and mine," Mr. Washington said, "is that you fought back, and you had the skills to protect yourself. You also had neighbors with cell phones who recorded everything. When my wife and I were going through our troubles, social media didn't exist yet, and people were less willing to get involved." Mr. Washington explained that he had eventually run for the HOA board himself and had worked to change some of the discriminatory practices. But he said that Robert Chen and a few other residents had continued to target people they saw as not fitting their image of the neighborhood. The national attention brought unexpected support from around the country. Sarah received messages from fellow veterans who had faced similar discrimination in their own communities. Military dog handlers from her old unit reached out to congratulate her on her handling of Max and to offer their support. But the attention also brought unwanted scrutiny and criticism. Some online comments questioned whether Sarah had exaggerated the threat or escalated the situation unnecessarily. Others suggested that she was playing the victim to get attention or money from a lawsuit. Sarah tried not to read the negative comments, but some of them hurt deeply. She had not asked for any of this attention, and she certainly had not wanted to become a symbol of anything larger than a mother trying to make a good home for her daughter. The most difficult part was the uncertainty about her future in Meadowbrook Heights. Several neighbors had expressed support for her, but she also knew that Robert Chen still had allies on the HOA board. The security company had not yet contacted her as she had requested, and she was not sure what their response would be to the national scrutiny. 3 days after the incident, Sarah received a certified letter from the HOA management company. She opened it with shaking hands, expecting another violation notice or perhaps even an eviction threat. Instead, she found something completely unexpected. The letter was an official apology from the board of directors, stating that they had reviewed the incident and found that Sarah had been subjected to inappropriate enforcement actions. The letter announced that all violation notices against Sarah were being dismissed, and that all fines would be refunded. More importantly, the letter stated that the HOA was immediately terminating its contract with Meadowbrook Security Services due to their unprofessional conduct during the incident. The board also announced that Robert Chen had submitted his resignation from his position, citing personal reasons. Sarah sat in her kitchen reading the letter while Maya slept peacefully in her bouncy seat. After weeks of stress and conflict, this felt like vindication. But she also knew that the real work was just beginning. The media attention had made her a public figure whether she wanted it or not. People were looking to her for leadership on issues of HOA reform and fair treatment of military veterans. Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility, but she also felt ready to embrace it. She looked around her small house, the home she had chosen because she wanted a quiet, safe place to raise her daughter. That dream had been shattered by discrimination and harassment, but something better had taken its place. Sarah had found her voice and her power, and she was beginning to understand how she could use both to help other people facing similar challenges. Maya stirred in her sleep and made a soft sound that brought Sarah back to the present moment. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage and determination that had gotten her through the confrontation with Max. She was a veteran, a mother, and now an advocate, and she was not going to let anyone push her around ever again. Outside her window, the neighborhood looked peaceful in the evening light, but Sarah knew that everything had changed, both for her and for Meadowbrook Heights. The quiet community she had moved to was becoming something different, hopefully something better and more fair for everyone who lived there. The neighborhood was completely silent except for the sound of Max panting as he continued to sit exactly where Sarah had commanded him. The German shepherd looked up at her with the trusting expression of a dog who had recognized a true professional, his tail wagging slightly against the grass. Sarah stood holding Maya, looking around at the crowd of neighbors who were still recording with their phones. She could see the shock on everyone's faces, from the 3 security officers to Robert Chen to the elderly man on his front porch. No one had expected a young mother to take control of a police dog with such complete authority. Officer Martinez was the first to break the silence. His face was pale and he looked confused as he stared at his own dog, who was completely ignoring him in favor of the woman he had just tried to attack. Martinez reached toward his radio, probably to call for backup or supervision, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Officer Martinez," she said calmly, keeping her tone respectful but firm. "Your dog is fine. He's just responding to someone who knows how to handle working animals properly." She looked down at Max, who was still sitting at attention. "Good boy, Max. You can relax now." Max immediately lay down and put his head on his paws, but he kept his eyes on Sarah. The transformation, from attack dog to well-behaved pet, was so complete that some of the watching neighbors actually laughed in relief and amazement. Sarah turned to face the 3 officers directly. Her military training had taught her how to project authority without being aggressive, and she used that skill now. "I need all of you to understand something very important," she said clearly. "What just happened here was a serious safety violation. You released a bite dog on a civilian holding an infant over a landscaping dispute." The younger security officer looked nervous and kept glancing at his partners. The older officer with gray hair was staring at Sarah with a new expression. Not the dismissive attitude he had shown before, but something closer to respect and worry about his own position. Sarah continued, her voice carrying to all the neighbors who were listening. I spent 6 years as a certified military dog handler with the 89th Military Police Brigade. I worked with German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and other working breeds in combat situations overseas. I know proper canine protocols, and what happened here was not proper. She gestured toward Max, who was still lying calmly at her feet. This is a good dog who has been trained to respond to specific commands and authority signals. But he was not under proper control when you released him. If I had not been able to stop him, he could have seriously injured me or my daughter. Robert Chen finally found his voice, but it came out as a stutter. This was just about lawn violations. We never intended. He trailed off as he realized that admitting he never intended for a dog to attack would also mean admitting the situation had gotten completely out of, and Officer Martinez tried to regain control of the situation. Ma'am, if you have military experience, you should understand that we were following proper procedures for a non-compliant subject. But his voice lacked conviction, and Sarah could see that he was starting to realize how bad this looked. Sarah shook her head firmly. No, officer. I do understand proper procedures, which is why I know that what you did was not proper. You escalated a civil dispute into a use of force situation without justification. You put an infant at risk, and you released a bite dog without proper warning or control. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who had been recording from the beginning, spoke up from across the yard. I got it all on video, she called out. The whole thing, from when they first accused Sarah of being aggressive, to when they let the dog loose, to when Sarah stopped it herself. Other neighbors began speaking up as well. The teenage boys on their bikes started talking about how unfair the officers had been. The elderly man on his porch called out that he had never seen Sarah be anything but polite and quiet. Even some neighbors who had not spoken to Sarah since she moved in began defending her actions. Sarah realized that the tide of community opinion was turning in her favor, but she also knew that this situation could still go very wrong if the officers felt embarrassed and decided to double down on their mistakes. She needed to find a way to de-escalate while also making sure everyone understood what had really happened. She knelt down next to Max and gently pet his head. The German Shepherd's tail wagged faster, and he looked up at her with obvious affection. You're a good boy, Max, she said softly. You were just doing what you were trained to do. It's not your fault that your handlers made poor decisions. Standing back up with Maya in her arms, Sarah addressed Officer Martinez directly. Officer, I'm not trying to make trouble for you or your partners, but I need you to understand that what happened here was dangerous and wrong. I'm a veteran who served my country, and I moved to this neighborhood because I wanted a safe place to raise my daughter. She gestured toward her small house and simple flower bed. I have been following all the rules to the best of my ability. When I received violation notices, I tried to address them properly through the official channels. I have never been aggressive or non-compliant with anyone, but somehow watering my approved plants on my own property escalated into having a bite dog released on me and my infant daughter. Martinez looked uncomfortable and kept glancing at the growing crowd of neighbors. Sarah could see him calculating the potential consequences of this incident. Multiple people had recorded everything, including his decision to release Max and Sarah's professional handling of the situation. The older security officer stepped forward and tried to take control. Ma'am, we appreciate your military service, but you need to understand that we were responding to reports of non-compliance and aggressive behavior. Sarah's expression hardened. Officer, I want you to look around at all these neighbors who are watching and recording. I want you to think about how this is going to look when they post these videos online, and I want you to consider whether you can honestly say that anything about my behavior today justified releasing a bite dog on me while I was holding my 3-month-old daughter. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Sarah could see the officers beginning to realize that they had made a serious mistake that could have major consequences for their careers and their company. Robert Chen looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, but Sarah was not finished. She had spent too many weeks being intimidated and harassed to let this moment pass without making her position completely clear. I moved to Meadowbrook Heights because I wanted to be part of a community, she said, her voice carrying across the neighborhood. I served my country for 6 years, and I know the value of rules and order. But what I've experienced here is not law and order. It's harassment and intimidation directed at a single mother and veteran who has done nothing wrong except refuse to be bullied. Maya chose that moment to make a soft cooing sound, reminding everyone present that an innocent baby had been put at risk by the officer's actions. The sound seemed to break something inside several of the watching neighbors, and Sarah could see anger beginning to replace shock on their faces. Officer Martinez finally seemed to realize that his best option was to retreat and regroup. He called Max to him, but the dog hesitated, looking back at Sarah as if asking for permission. Sarah nodded at Max and said, "Go on, boy. Go with your handler." Max trotted over to Martinez, who clipped the leash back on with shaking hands. The three officers began walking toward their vehicles, but Sarah's voice stopped them one more time. "Officers," she called out clearly, "I expect a full report of this incident to be filed with your supervisors, and I expect someone to contact me within 24 hours to discuss how we're going to resolve this situation properly." As the security vehicles drove away, Sarah was surrounded by neighbors who had suddenly found their voices. People who had never spoken to her before were introducing themselves and apologizing for not standing up to Robert Chen's harassment earlier. Mrs. Patterson promised to send her the video footage. Others offered to serve as witnesses if Sarah needed to file complaints. But even as Sarah accepted their support and thanks, she knew that this incident was just the beginning. The videos would spread beyond the neighborhood, and questions would be asked about what had happened in Meadowbrook Heights. Sarah had found her voice and her power, but she also knew that she had made some very serious enemies. As she carried Maya back into their house, Sarah looked back at the flower bed that had started it all. The marigolds and petunias looked peaceful and innocent in the morning sun, giving no sign that they had just been the center of a confrontation that would change everything. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut as Sarah stood on her own front lawn, surrounded by 3 security officers and facing down a German shepherd that seemed eager for action. Maya was quiet in the baby carrier, but Sarah could feel her daughter's small body pressed against her chest, a constant reminder of what she had to protect. Officer Martinez tightened his grip on the dog's leash as he studied Sarah's face. The German shepherd, which Sarah could now see had Max embroidered on his working vest, was pulling forward slightly, his ears up and alert. Sarah recognized all the signs of a dog that had been trained for aggressive apprehension work rather than careful detection or controlled searches. Robert Chen stepped back from the flower bed and brushed dirt off his hands with obvious satisfaction. He looked directly at Sarah and said in a loud voice that carried to the growing crowd of neighbors, "This resident has consistently refused to follow community standards and has now become hostile when asked to comply with reasonable requests." Sarah felt her heart racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. Her military training had taught her that panic was the enemy in dangerous situations. She needed to think clearly and react appropriately to protect herself and Maya. She could see more neighbors coming out of their houses, some with cell phones already recording the confrontation. The first security officer, the older man with gray hair, stepped closer to Sarah and spoke in the authoritative tone that police officers use when they want to establish control. He told Sarah that she was being non-compliant and creating a disturbance in the neighborhood. He said she needed to agree immediately to remove all the plants in question and stop arguing with lawful enforcement actions. Sarah tried once more to explain her position reasonably. She kept her voice calm and respectful as she said, "Officers, I have documentation inside my house that shows all these plants are approved varieties from the HOA's official list. If you give me 2 minutes, I can get the paperwork and clear this up." But her words seemed to have the opposite effect than she intended. Martinez shook his head and told his partner, "She's still arguing and making excuses. She's not cooperating." The younger officer nodded and spoke into his radio again, saying they had a continued non-compliance situation that might require additional intervention. Sarah felt a chill of fear as she realized these men had no interest in seeing her documentation or resolving the situation peacefully. They had already decided she was guilty of something, and they were looking for an excuse to escalate their response. She had seen this mentality before in poorly trained security personnel, who confused aggression with professionalism. The crowd of neighbors was growing larger. Sarah could see Mrs. Patterson from next door holding her phone up, clearly recording everything. 2 teenage boys from down the street had stopped their bikes to watch. An elderly man she did not recognize was standing on his front porch, shaking his head with disapproval. though Sarah was not sure if his disapproval was aimed at her or at the security officers. Officer Martinez looked at the crowd and seemed to interpret their attention as pressure to take stronger action. He told Sarah in a loud voice, "Ma'am, you have been given multiple opportunities to cooperate voluntarily. Your continued resistance and argumentative behavior is creating a safety concern for the community." Sarah was stunned by this characterization of her behavior. She had been polite and cooperative throughout the entire confrontation. She had put down her watering can when asked. She had stepped back from her flower bed. She had kept her hands visible and her voice calm. But somehow her attempts to explain her side of the story were being labeled as resistance and non-compliance. The situation reached a breaking point when Robert Chen spoke up again. He told the officers that Sarah had a history of violating community standards and had previously been aggressive during enforcement encounters. This was completely false. Sarah had never been aggressive with anyone, but the officers seemed to believe every word he said. Martinez made a decision that would change everything. He looked at his partners and said, "She's escalating the situation and refusing to comply. We need to take control before this gets worse." Sarah watched in horror as he reached for the release mechanism. On Max's leash, the German Shepherd must have sensed the change in his handler's energy because he became more alert and focused. His ears perked forward and his body tensed as he prepared for action. Sarah recognized these signs from her years of working with military dogs, and she knew what was about to happen. Martinez gave Max the command to watch Sarah, which caused the dog to fix his attention on her with laser-like intensity. The officer then told Sarah that she had one last chance to cooperate before they were forced to take stronger action. But before Sarah could respond, Robert Chen pointed at her and said, "She's reaching for something." Sarah looked down at herself in confusion. Her hands were empty and visible. She was not reaching for anything except to keep Maya secure in the baby carrier. But Martinez apparently decided that Chen's warning was credible because he made the fatal decision to release Max from his leash. The command came sharp and clear. "Max, apprehend." The German Shepherd launched himself forward with the speed and power that made his breed so effective in law enforcement work. But as he charged toward Sarah and her infant daughter, something extraordinary happened that none of the officers had expected. Sarah's 6 years of military dog handler training took over instantly. Her body moved on pure instinct, shifting to protect Maya while her voice rang out with the kind of authority that working dogs are trained from puppyhood to obey. "Max, halt," Sarah commanded in the deep, firm tone that she had used hundreds of times with military working dogs. The words carried the unmistakable sound of someone who knew exactly how to communicate with a trained animal. Max, who had been charging forward at full speed, suddenly stopped so abruptly that his back legs skidded on the grass. His ears went back and his head tilted in confusion as he processed the unexpected command from someone other than his handler. But Sarah was not finished. Drawing on years of experience working with German Shepherds in high-stress situations, she continued with a series of commands that Max's training forced him to recognize and obey. "Sit. Stay," she ordered, her voice carrying across the entire neighborhood. To everyone's absolute amazement, Max sat down immediately and stayed perfectly still, as if he had been switched from attack mode to training mode in the space of 2 seconds. His tail wagged slightly as he looked up at Sarah with the expression of a dog who had found someone who spoke his language. The 3 security officers stood frozen in shock. Robert Chen's mouth was hanging open. The neighbors who had been recording stopped moving their phones as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. Sarah, her heart pounding but her voice still steady, looked at Max and said, "Good boy. Easy now." She then turned to face the officers with a calm authority that commanded immediate respect. "I spent 6 years as a military dog handler with the 89th Military Police Brigade," she said clearly, making sure her words carried to all the neighbors who were watching and recording. "I know exactly how to work with canine units, and I know that dog was not properly controlled." The silence that followed was broken only by Max panting softly as he continued to sit and stay exactly where Sarah had told him to. The German Shepherd looked content and relaxed, showing none of the tension and aggression he had displayed just moments earlier. Sarah carefully knelt down and removed Maya from the baby carrier, checking her daughter for any signs of injury or distress. The baby looked up at her mother with wide, curious eyes, seemingly unaware of how close they had both come to serious harm. As Sarah stood back up with Maya in her arms, she could see the officers beginning to realize the gravity of what had just happened. They had released an attack dog on a woman holding an infant, and that woman had turned out to be a trained military professional who could control their animal better than they could. The cameras were still rolling, and Sarah knew that what happened next would determine whether this incident ended quietly or became something much bigger. She looked around at her neighbors, at the officers, at Robert Chen, and at Max, who was still sitting patiently where she had commanded him to stay. Sarah had found her voice and her power in a moment of extreme danger. Now she had to decide what to do with both. Sarah woke up at 5:30 on Wednesday morning to the sound of Maya crying. The baby had been restless all night, probably sensing the tension that had filled their small house over the past 2 weeks. Sarah felt exhausted, but she knew that keeping busy would help her manage the stress of the upcoming HOA meeting scheduled for that evening. After feeding Maya and getting her settled in the bouncy seat, Sarah decided to tackle some outdoor tasks before the day got too hot. She had received another violation notice the day before, this time about neglected landscaping maintenance. Sarah could not see any problems with her small flower bed, but she wanted to make sure everything looked perfect before the board meeting. She strapped Maya into the baby carrier that allowed her to keep her daughter close while working outside. The carrier had been a gift from her military friends when Maya was born, designed to distribute weight evenly so Sarah could move freely while keeping the baby safe and comfortable. The morning air was cool and pleasant as Sarah gathered her watering can and small gardening tools. Her flower bed contained simple, low-maintenance plants that she had chosen carefully from the HOA's approved plant list. Marigolds, petunias, and small hostas created a colorful but modest display along the front edge of her property. Sarah had just started watering the marigolds when she heard footsteps on the sidewalk behind her. She turned to see Robert Chen approaching her property, but this time he was not alone. 2 men in dark blue uniforms walked beside him, both wearing badges and utility belts that marked them as security officers. Sarah's military training immediately kicked in as she assessed the situation. The men looked like police officers, but their uniforms were slightly different. Their badges said Meadowbrook Security Services instead of showing a city or county name. These were private security guards, not real police officers. Robert stopped at the edge of Sarah's property line and pointed toward her flower bed. He spoke loudly enough for neighbors to hear, saying that he had documented unauthorized landscaping modifications that violated multiple community standards. He claimed Sarah was installing new plants without architectural committee approval. Sarah stood up slowly, keeping her movements calm and non-threatening. She could feel Maya shifting slightly in the carrier, probably responding to the change in tension. Sarah kept her voice steady and polite as she explained that she was simply watering existing plants that had been in the ground since before she moved in. One of the security officers, a large man with gray hair and a stern expression, stepped forward and told Sarah to stop all yard work immediately. He said they had received reports of a resident becoming aggressive and non-compliant with HOA enforcement efforts. Sarah realized with growing alarm that Robert had somehow convinced these men that she was a troublemaker who might become violent. The second security officer was younger and seemed less sure of himself, but he moved to support his partner's position. He told Sarah that she needed to put down her watering can and step away from the flower bed until the situation could be resolved. His hand rested on his radio, ready to call for additional help if needed. Sarah felt a familiar surge of adrenaline that she recognized from her military days. Her body was preparing for a potential threat, but her mind stayed focused on protecting. "Maya!" She set down the watering can as requested and held up her hands to show she was not carrying anything dangerous. She tried to explain that she was simply maintaining her existing landscaping, not installing anything new. She offered to show Robert and the officers her copy of the approved plant list, which clearly included all the flowers in her garden. But Robert interrupted her, saying that she had a pattern of violating community standards and arguing with legitimate enforcement actions. The situation escalated quickly when the first security officer claimed that Sarah was becoming agitated and displaying aggressive body language. Sarah was confused by this accusation because she had been careful to remain calm and cooperative. She realized that these men had already decided she was a problem, and nothing she said or did would change their minds. The younger officer spoke into his radio, requesting backup for what he described as a non-compliant resident situation. Sarah heard him mention that there was a minor child present and that they might need additional resources to ensure everyone's safety. The phrase made Sarah's blood run cold because she knew it probably meant they were calling for a K-9 unit. Within minutes, a third security vehicle pulled up to the curb. Sarah watched in growing horror as another officer got out, followed by a large German Shepherd on a leash. The dog looked alert and focused, clearly trained for law enforcement work. Sarah recognized the signs of a patrol dog that had been trained for aggressive apprehension rather than simple detection work. The K-9 officer introduced himself as Officer Martinez and asked for a quick briefing on the situation. Robert Chen immediately stepped forward to provide his version of events, describing Sarah as an uncooperative resident who had repeatedly violated community standards and was now refusing to comply with enforcement actions. Martinez looked at Sarah with suspicion and told her that they were trying to resolve the situation peacefully, but she needed to cooperate fully with their instructions. He asked her to step back from her property and allow them to inspect the landscaping that had caused the complaint. Sarah felt trapped and frightened, but she was most concerned about Maya's safety. The baby was quiet in the carrier, but Sarah could feel her small body pressed against her chest. If this situation continued to escalate, Sarah was worried that someone might get hurt. Especially if the dog was released, she took several steps back as requested, moving closer to her front door in case she needed to get Maya inside quickly. But her movement seemed to make the officers more nervous rather than less. The K-9 officer kept a tight grip on his dog's leash while watching Sarah's every move. Robert Chen walked into Sarah's flower bed and began pointing out what he claimed were violations. He said the marigolds were planted too close to the property line. He claimed the petunias were a variety that had not been approved by the architectural committee. He even suggested that the arrangement of the plants created an unauthorized decorative pattern that changed the approved landscape design. Sarah listened to these accusations with growing disbelief. Every plant in her garden had come from the approved list. She had been careful to place them in simple, straight rows that matched the landscaping of other houses in the neighborhood. Robert was making up violations that did not exist, but the security officers seemed to believe every word he said. The first security officer told Sarah that she would need to remove all the questioned plants immediately and submit new landscaping plans for approval before replanting anything. He said that failure to comply would result in additional fines and possible legal action by the homeowners association. Sarah tried one more time to explain her position calmly and reasonably. She told the officers that she had documentation showing all her plants were approved varieties. She offered to get the paperwork from inside her house to prove her compliance with community standards. But Officer Martinez cut her off, saying that they had heard enough explanations and excuses. He said Sarah had been given multiple opportunities to cooperate voluntarily, and now they needed to take stronger action to ensure community safety. The tone of his voice and the way he gripped the dog's leash made it clear that he was preparing to escalate the situation to the next level. Ray realized with growing fear that these men were looking for an excuse to use force against her. They had already decided she was guilty of something, and they were not interested in hearing evidence to the contrary. She thought about her military training and her experience dealing with dangerous situations, but this felt different because Maya was with her. As she looked at the German Shepherd straining against its leash, Sarah felt a chill of recognition. The dog reminded her of the military working dogs she had trained with overseas. But unlike those well-disciplined animals, this dog seemed excited and eager for action in a way that suggested poor training or handling. Sarah knew that what happened next would determine whether this confrontation ended peacefully or became something much worse. She could see neighbors starting to come out of their houses, drawn by the commotion. Some were taking pictures with their phones. Others were calling out to ask what was happening. The moment felt like it was balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip in either direction. Sarah held Maya closer and prepared herself for whatever was about to happen, hoping that her military training and her love for her daughter would be enough to get them both through this safely. 3 days after Sarah submitted her appeal letter, she received the HOA's response in her mailbox. The single sheet of paper contained just 4 short sentences typed in cold official language. The appeal was denied. The violation remained in effect. The garden gnome must be removed within 2 days or additional fines would apply. No explanation was given for the decision. Sarah stared at the letter while holding Maya in her arms. The baby was having a fussy day and had been crying on and off since morning. Sarah felt her own stress level rising as she tried to process what this meant for her and her daughter's future in Meadowbrook Heights. She called the management company again, hoping to speak with someone who could explain the decision or suggest next steps. This time a different woman answered, someone named Linda who sounded even less interested than Patricia had been. Linda told Sarah that appeal decisions were final and could only be overturned by a full board vote, which would require a formal hearing request and a $100 fee. Sarah hung up feeling defeated and confused. She had followed every rule she could find. She had measured the gnome, photographed it, researched the guidelines, and submitted a professional appeal. Nothing had mattered. Someone had decided she was wrong, and now she had to choose between removing her mother's gift or fighting an expensive battle against people who clearly had more time and resources than she did. That evening, Sarah sat in her kitchen making a difficult decision. She could not afford to keep paying fees and fines while taking care of Maya on her limited income. With great sadness, she went outside and moved her mother's garden gnome from its place by the mailbox to a less visible spot behind her front porch. The gnome looked out of place in its new location, hidden between 2 small bushes where it could barely be seen. Sarah felt like she was hiding her mother's memory, and the thought made her eyes fill with tears, but she told herself this was temporary. Once she got more settled and understood the neighborhood dynamics better, she would find a way to display the gnome properly. Sarah thought removing the gnome would end her problems with the HOA, but she was wrong. 2 days later, another orange violation notice appeared on her front door. This time, the complaint was about her grass height. According to the notice, sections of her lawn exceeded the 3-inch maximum height requirement by as much as half an inch in some areas. Sarah was baffled by this new violation. She had mowed her lawn just 5 days earlier, using the same settings she had always used. The grass looked perfectly normal to her, no different from her neighbors' lawns. She borrowed a ruler from her kitchen drawer and went outside to measure random sections of her yard. Most of the grass was well within the 3-inch limit. A few areas near the edges of her property were slightly longer, maybe 3¼ inches at most. Sarah could not understand how such a small difference could result in a violation notice, especially when she could see longer grass in several of her neighbors' yards. She looked around more carefully and noticed Robert Chen standing in his driveway, watching her measure her grass. When their eyes met, he walked over to the property line between their yards. He was carrying a small notebook and a camera. Robert told Sarah that he had been monitoring her property since the gnome incident to ensure she followed all community guidelines properly. He said that as a board member, he had a responsibility to maintain neighborhood standards. He had measured her grass himself the day before and found multiple violations of the height requirement. Sarah tried to stay calm as she pointed out that her grass was only slightly longer than the limit in a few small areas. She also mentioned that other yards in the neighborhood appeared to have similar variations in grass length. Robert's response shocked her with its hostility. He told Sarah that other residents had earned the right to small oversights through years of good behavior and community involvement. As a new resident who had already violated the decoration policy, she would be held to stricter standards until she proved herself worthy of the community's trust. Sarah felt her face grow hot with anger and embarrassment. Robert was essentially telling her that she would be treated differently from other residents because of her previous violation. This seemed completely unfair and possibly discriminatory, but Sarah did not know what to do about it. She went inside and called the management company again, hoping to file a complaint about Robert's behavior. This time Patricia answered, and she listened to Sarah's concerns with obvious impatience. Patricia told Sarah that board members had the authority to monitor compliance and report violations as they saw fit. If Sarah was concerned about selective enforcement, she could file a formal complaint with the state regulatory agency that oversaw homeowners associations. Sarah realized she was being pushed into an expensive and time-consuming legal process that she could not afford. She was a single mother with a newborn baby, living on veterans' benefits while looking for steady employment. She did not have the time or money to fight a legal battle against an entire homeowners association. Instead, Sarah decided to try a different approach. She mowed her lawn again, this time cutting it shorter than she normally would. She also trimmed the edges very carefully, making sure every blade of grass was well within the 3-inch limit. She hoped this would show her willingness to comply and end the harassment, but the violations continued to come. Over the next week, Sarah received notices for leaving her garden hose visible after watering her small flower bed, for having a welcome mat that was the wrong shade of brown, and for parking her car in a way that extended 6 inches beyond the acceptable parking area in her driveway. Each violation came with its own fine and deadline for correction. Sarah was spending more time dealing with HOA complaints than she was spending on job applications or taking care of Maya. The stress was affecting her sleep and her ability to focus on important tasks. The welcome mat violation particularly upset Sarah because the mat had been a gift from her upstairs neighbor in her old apartment building. The woman had given it to Sarah as a moving present, saying it would help her new house feel like home. The mat was brown with yellow sunflowers, cheerful and welcoming. According to the violation notice, the yellow flowers were not an approved color scheme for front door decorations. Sarah looked at the welcome mats of other houses in her neighborhood. She saw mats with red flowers, blue patterns, green designs, and even one with a rainbow pattern. None of these seemed to have received violation notices, even though they were far more colorful than her simple sunflower mat. She began to realize that Robert Chen was targeting her specifically, looking for any excuse to issue violations and fines. Other residents were not being held to the same standards, and their more obvious violations were being ignored. Sarah was being singled out for reasons she did not fully understand. The situation came to a head when Sarah received a notice about a special HOA board meeting scheduled for the following week. The notice stated that the meeting would address ongoing compliance issues with a specific resident and would consider additional enforcement measures to ensure community standards. Sarah knew the meeting was about her. She also knew that additional enforcement measures could mean anything from increased fines to legal action to forced removal from the neighborhood. She felt trapped and afraid, worried about what this could mean for her and Maya's future. Sarah had faced dangerous situations during her military service, but this felt different and more threatening. In the Army, she had known who her enemies were and what they wanted. Here in Meadowbrook Heights, she was facing people who smiled and acted polite while trying to destroy her life for reasons she could not understand. She began to research her options, looking for legal resources for veterans and single mothers. She also started documenting every interaction with Robert Chen and the HOA, keeping copies of all violations and taking photographs of her property after each correction. If this situation was going to escalate, Sarah wanted to be prepared. But as she tucked Maya into her crib that night, Sarah felt more isolated and vulnerable than she had since leaving the military. The neighborhood she had chosen for its safety and community feel had become a place of constant stress and conflict. She wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in moving to Meadowbrook Heights, and whether she would be able to protect her daughter from the growing hostility around them. Sarah woke up to Maya's soft crying at 6 a.m. The baby had slept through the night for the first time since they moved to Meadowbrook Heights, giving Sarah her first full night of rest in weeks. She felt hopeful as she prepared Maya's bottle and changed her diaper. Today felt like it would be a good day. After feeding Maya and getting her settled in the bouncy seat, Sarah decided to check the mail. She had been expecting some important documents from the Veterans Administration about her benefits. The morning air was cool and fresh as she walked barefoot across the soft grass to her mailbox. That was when she saw it. A bright orange piece of paper taped to her front door, fluttering in the gentle breeze. The color was so bold and attention-grabbing that Sarah's stomach immediately tightened with worry. She had seen notices like this before, but never on her own door. Sarah pulled the paper free and read the heading printed in large black letters. Homeowners Association, Violation Notice. Below that, her name and address were typed in smaller text. Her hand started to shake slightly as she read the details of the complaint. The notice accused her of violating Section 4.7 of the Community Guidelines by placing unauthorized lawn decorations on her property. It specifically mentioned a garden gnome located near her mailbox that had been installed without proper approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The violation carried a fine of $50 with additional penalties if the item was not removed within 7 days. Sarah looked over at her mailbox, confused and upset. The garden gnome in question was small and tasteful, barely 8 inches tall. It was painted in soft colors, brown, green, and cream, that matched the natural surroundings. More importantly, it was the last gift her mother had given her before passing away from cancer 6 months ago. Her mother, Janet Williams, had fought breast cancer for 2 years before losing the battle. During her final weeks in the hospital, she had asked Sarah to bring her purse from home. Inside was a small wrapped package containing the garden gnome and a handwritten note. The note explained that the gnome was meant to bring good luck and protection to Sarah's new home, wherever that might be. Sarah had cried when she read her mother's words, written in the shaky handwriting that showed how weak the cancer had made her. The gnome represented her mother's love and hope for Sarah's future happiness. Placing it by the mailbox had been Sarah's way of honoring her mother's memory and keeping her spirit close to their new home. Now some stranger was telling her it was against the rules and had to be removed. Sarah felt a mix of anger and sadness that surprised her with its intensity. She had followed all the moving procedures correctly. She had read the HOA handbook from cover to cover. She had been careful to follow every guideline she could find. Sarah went back inside and pulled out her copy of the Homeowners Association rules. She sat at her kitchen table with Maya sleeping peacefully nearby and began searching for Section 4.7. When she found it, she read the language very carefully, making sure she understood every word. The section dealt with lawn decorations and yard ornaments. It listed several categories of items that were prohibited without approval: statues over 12 inches tall, fountains, flags other than the American flag, and decorative lighting that could be seen from the street. But it also included a list of acceptable items that did not require approval: small garden stones, plants in earth-tone pots, wind chimes under 10 inches in length, and decorative items under 10 inches in height that complemented the natural landscape. Sarah measured her mother's gnome with a ruler. It was exactly 7 3/4 inches tall. The colors were earth tones that blended well with her small garden area. According to her reading of the rules, the gnome should be acceptable without special approval. She read the section 3 more times to make sure she was not missing anything important. Each time she read it, she became more convinced that the violation notice was incorrect. Someone had made a mistake, or perhaps they had not taken the time to measure the gnome or consider its colors and placement. Sarah decided to contest the violation. She had learned in the military that it was important to stand up for yourself when you knew you were right. She also felt a strong need to protect her mother's memory and the meaning of the small gift. She called the HOA management company number listed on the violation notice. A woman named Patricia answered the phone in a tired, bored voice that suggested she handled many calls like this every day. Sarah explained her situation politely and professionally. She gave her address and violation number, then described the garden gnome and why she believed it complied with the community guidelines. She quoted the exact language from Section 4.7 and offered to provide measurements and photographs if needed. Patricia put her on hold for several minutes while she looked up the complaint. When she returned to the phone, her tone had not changed. She told Sarah that the violation had been reported by a community member and reviewed by the board. If Sarah wanted to contest it, she would need to submit a written appeal within 5 days, along with supporting documentation and a $25 processing fee. Sarah felt frustrated by the bureaucracy, but she agreed to submit the appeal. She had been hoping for a simple phone conversation that would clear up the misunderstanding. Instead, she was being forced into a formal process that would cost her time and money to prove she was following the rules correctly. After hanging up, Sarah spent the afternoon preparing her appeal letter. She took photographs of the gnome from multiple angles, showing its size relative to surrounding objects. She included measurements and quotes from the HOA guidelines. She wrote a respectful but firm letter explaining her position and requesting that the violation be dismissed. She also included a brief explanation about the gnome's sentimental value, hoping that whoever reviewed her appeal would understand why removing it would cause her personal pain. She did not expect special treatment because of her mother's death, but she hoped it would encourage them to look more carefully at the rules before forcing her to remove her mother's gift. The next morning, Sarah walked to the mailbox to send her appeal letter. As she approached the mailbox, she noticed the same man who had been jogging past her house every day. Today he was not jogging. Instead, he was standing on the sidewalk in front of her neighbor's house, talking on his cell phone and looking directly at her property. When he saw Sarah coming, he ended his phone call quickly and started walking toward her. He was probably in his 50s with gray hair and an expensive-looking jogging outfit. His expression was serious and somewhat unfriendly. The man introduced himself as Robert Chen, a member of the HOA board and a resident of the neighborhood for 8 years. He told Sarah he was the person who had reported her violation. He had noticed the unauthorized decoration during one of his regular neighborhood walks and felt it was his duty to report it to the management company. Sarah tried to remain calm and polite as she explained her position. She told Robert about her research into the guidelines and her belief that the gnome was within the acceptable size and color requirements. She mentioned that she had submitted an appeal that morning. Robert's response surprised her with its coldness. He told her that the rules were very clear, and that all decorative items needed approval before installation. He said that allowing unauthorized decorations would set a bad precedent and could lead to the neighborhood looking cluttered and unprofessional. When Sarah mentioned the sentimental value of the gnome, Robert's expression did not soften at all. He told her that personal feelings could not override community standards. If everyone was allowed to bend the rules for emotional reasons, the neighborhood would lose the high standards that made it desirable. Sarah felt her military training kick in as she worked to control her temper. She had dealt with difficult people before and knew that losing her cool would only make the situation worse. She thanked Robert for explaining his position and told him she looked forward to the appeal process resolving the matter fairly. But as Robert walked away, Sarah had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger problem. The man's attitude suggested that he saw her as an outsider who needed to be controlled and corrected. Sarah had experienced similar treatment before, and she recognized the signs of someone who had already made up his mind about her. Maya started crying from inside the house, reminding Sarah that she had bigger responsibilities than neighborhood politics. But as she walked back to comfort her daughter, Sarah could not shake the feeling that her peaceful new life in Meadowbrook Heights was about to become much more complicated. Sarah Williams stood at her new front door, holding her 3-month-old baby girl close to her chest. The morning sun felt warm on her face as she looked out at Meadowbrook Heights for the first time as a resident. The neighborhood was everything she had hoped for when she signed the lease 3 weeks ago. Clean sidewalks lined both sides of the street. Every house had a perfect green lawn. The mailboxes all looked the same, painted in approved colors that matched each home. She had driven through this area many times before making her decision. Each visit showed her the same peaceful scene. Children rode bikes on the quiet streets while their parents watched from front porches. Dog walkers strolled by in the early evening hours. Everyone seemed to know each other, waving and stopping to chat by the mailboxes. This was exactly what Sarah wanted for her daughter Maya. The move here had taken months of planning and saving. Sarah used her military benefits to secure the small 2-bedroom house on Elm Street. The rent was higher than her old apartment, but the safety and quiet were worth every extra dollar. After 6 years in the Army, she had learned to value peace and stability above almost everything else. Her time in the military had changed her in ways most people could never understand. She had served as a dog handler with the 89th Military Police Brigade, working alongside some of the smartest and most loyal animals she had ever met. German Shepherds and Belgian Malinois had been her daily companions during her tours overseas. These dogs were not pets. They were highly trained partners who could detect bombs, find hidden enemies, and protect soldiers in dangerous situations. Sarah remembered her first day of dog handler training like it was yesterday. The instructors were tough and demanding. They taught her that working with military dogs required patience, respect, and complete understanding of animal behavior. She learned to read every signal a dog would give her. The position of their ears, the way they held their tail, the sound of their breathing. All of these things told her what the dog was thinking and feeling. Over the years, she had worked with 12 different dogs. Each one had its own personality and special skills. There was Rex, a German Shepherd who could find hidden weapons better than any machine. Luna, a Belgian Malinois who never missed a threat during patrol missions. And Max, a gentle giant who looked fierce but loved to play with tennis balls during off-duty hours. Sarah had learned to speak their language, and they had learned to trust her completely. But those days were behind her now. Sarah had received an honorable discharge after her final tour ended 8 months ago. She was proud of her service but ready to start a new chapter as a civilian. The transition had not been easy. Finding work was harder than she expected. Many employers did not understand her military experience or know how to use her skills in their businesses. Then she discovered she was pregnant with Maya, and everything changed again. The baby's father had left when he learned about the pregnancy, leaving Sarah to face motherhood alone. But she was not afraid. The Army had taught her to be strong and independent. She could handle anything life threw at her. Maya was born on a cold February morning, healthy and beautiful. Sarah held her daughter for the first time and made a promise. This little girl would grow up in a safe place, surrounded by good people and opportunities. Sarah would make sure of that. Finding the right neighborhood became Sarah's mission. She spent weeks driving around different areas, looking for the perfect combination of safety, schools, and community feel. Meadowbrook Heights checked every box on her list. The crime rate was low. The elementary school had excellent ratings. The houses were well maintained and the residents seemed to take pride in their community. The homeowners association rules were strict, but Sarah saw this as a good thing. Rules meant order. Order meant safety. She had lived under military regulations for 6 years, so following neighborhood guidelines would not be difficult. The HOA handbook was thick, with detailed rules about everything from lawn care to holiday decorations. Sarah read every page twice, taking notes about important points. Some of the rules seemed very specific. Grass could not be higher than 3 inches during growing season. Garden hoses must be stored out of sight when not in use. Only certain types of plants were allowed in front yard gardens. Mailbox decorations had to be approved by the architectural committee before installation, but Sarah did not mind these requirements. Structure and discipline had been part of her life for so long that she felt comfortable with clear expectations. Her new house was small, but perfect for her needs. The living room had large windows that let in plenty of natural light. The kitchen was just big enough for her to prepare meals while keeping an eye on Maya in her bouncy seat. The master bedroom was peaceful and quiet, with a view of the backyard where Sarah planned to create a small garden. The second bedroom became Maya's nursery. Sarah had spent hours painting the walls a soft yellow color and setting up the crib, changing table, and rocking chair. She hung pictures of flowers and butterflies on the walls, creating a cheerful space for her daughter to grow up in. A small bookshelf held the children's books Sarah had already started collecting, planning to read to Maya every night. In the first few days after moving in, Sarah focused on getting settled and establishing routines with Maya. The baby was a good sleeper, which gave Sarah time to unpack boxes and organize their new home. She made lists of things she needed to buy and tasks she wanted to complete. Organization had always been one of her strengths, learned during her military training and perfected over years of service. The neighbors seemed friendly but distant. A few people waved when she carried Maya to and from the car, but no one stopped to introduce themselves or welcome her to the neighborhood. Sarah understood that people were busy with their own lives. She hoped that over time, she would have opportunities to meet people and build relationships in the community. One neighbor did catch her attention. An older man who lived 3 houses down often walked by her house during his morning jogs. He always looked directly at her property as he passed, sometimes slowing down to examine her front yard more closely. Sarah noticed him checking out her mailbox, looking at her small front garden area, and even taking pictures with his phone on one occasion. She assumed he was just curious about the new resident. In military housing, people often kept an eye on each other's properties as a form of community security. Maybe Meadowbrook Heights residents did the same thing. Sarah decided not to worry about it unless the man's behavior became more intrusive. What Sarah did not know was that her peaceful new life was about to be tested in ways she never expected. The quiet neighborhood she had chosen for its safety and order would soon become the setting for a confrontation that would change everything. But for now, in these first few weeks, Sarah simply enjoyed the calm mornings with Maya, the clean air, and the promise of a better future in Meadowbrook Heights.